Exodus chapter 1. We began last week with this adventure in Exodus, this incredible Exodus adventure. I gave you a little bit of background information last week, if you remember. We're not going to read it yet, Jordan. We're not going to read it yet. Yep, okay. With a little bit of background, really last week we looked at how did God's people end up in Egypt. And it basically, as we've said, it basically came down to one person. But if you really want to dig deeper, if you really want to go there, one could make the argument that the people ended up in Egypt because of the 12 brothers who sold Joseph into slavery. Thereby, Joseph ended up in Egypt. And if you really, really want to dig deeper, we could go back to the favoritism that Jacob gave to his son Joseph, thereby making his brothers angry, causing them to do what they did, and still we have Joseph in Egypt. However it took place, we're here in Exodus 1. The people of God have found themselves in Egypt. And the reason why Egypt, I believe, and many others, I guess I can't be the only one who says this, right? It's the reason why this story Exodus is such an important story in the imagination of the people, and why it's important. The reason why we believe these things are important is that this story here in Exodus sets the stage for the ways that the people of God live and operate in the world. And we're going to expand on that. And so this morning, we're going to begin in Exodus chapter 1, and we're going to read in verse 8. It's a lengthy kind of text, and Jordan's going to put that up there for me. So sit back and enjoy this little narrative that we have, all right? I'll try and give it a little bit of Lonnie touch to it, just in case you nod off here. Now, a new king came to power in Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "The Israelite people are now larger in number and stronger than we are. Come on, let's be smart and deal with them. Otherwise, they will only grow in number, and if the war breaks out, they will join our enemies, they will fight against us, and then escape from the land." Verse 11. And as a result, the Egyptians put foremen of forced work gangs over the Israelites to harass them with hard work. They had to build storage cities named Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they grew and spread. So much so that the Egyptians started to look at the Israelites with disgust and dread. So the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites. They made their lives miserable with hard labor, making mortar and bricks, doing field work, and by forcing them to do all kinds of other cruel work. Verse 15, the king of Egypt spoke to two Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah. When are you helping the Hebrew women? When you are helping the Hebrew women give birth, and you see the baby being born, he said, if it's a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, you can let her live. Now the two midwives respected God, so they did not obey the king's order. Instead, they let the baby boys live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why are you doing this? Why are you letting the baby boys live?" Well, the two midwives said to Pharaoh, "Well, because Hebrew women aren't like Egyptian women. They are much stronger, and they give birth before any of the midwives can get to them. We can't help it. It happens before we get there." So they said. So God treated the midwives well, and the people kept on multiplying. It became very strong. And because the midwives respected God, God gave them households of their own. Then Pharaoh gave an order to all of his people: throw every baby born to the Hebrews into the Nile River, but you can let all the girls live. Now a man from Levi's household married a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that the baby was healthy and beautiful, so she hid him for 3 months. When she couldn't hide him any longer, she took a reed basket, sealed it up with black tar. She put the baby in the basket and set the basket among the reeds at the riverbank. The baby's older sister watched nearby to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river. while her women servants walked along beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent one of her servants to bring it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child. The boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. She said, "Well, this must be one of the Hebrews' children." Then the baby's sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Would you like me to go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" How about that? Pharaoh's daughter said, "Well, yeah, go ahead, do that." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay you for your work to care for your own child." There's a good deal right there. She brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, she adopted him as her son. And she named him, Pharaoh's daughter did, Moses, because I pulled him out of the water. Walter Brueggemann, one of my favorite, yes, he's at the top of the food chain, one of my favorite Old Testament scholars, I love this guy, he says that there is one story, just one primary story in Scripture that just repeats itself over and over and over again. And it's this. It is a story about how God has called and formed his people to be his unique people in the world. The entire Scripture is about God calling and forming and shaping his people. But the problem with doing that, as we've said a lot, and we'll say it more, the problem with that is that these people also happen to live in Egypt or Rome or Babylon. In other words, they live amongst the lands of empire, which is true for us today, right? So the question can be the same for us that those people encountered as well. What does it mean to live here where we're at in this time and in this place? What does it mean for us to live here what does it mean to be a people of God living in the time that we're living in? And that's a really hard question. It's a really messy question. And there are really no great answers for that. I wish it were easy. I'm sure you wish it were easy, but it's not. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament, he writes this: "How do we live in the world but not be of it?" Fundamental question of the New Testament. How do you be of the world? How do you be in the world but not of it? So just don't feel bad when you ask that question, because Paul asked it too. And if it's okay for Paul the Apostle to ask that question, how do I do this? It's certainly okay for us to do that as well. As I shared last week, we've kind of talked about it already this morning. The Exodus story really begins at the end of Genesis, where Joseph receives the favor of Pharaoh, and Joseph interprets the dreams of Pharaoh, and he helps the economics of Egypt. And Joseph and Pharaoh are kind of hand in hand in this, and Joseph helps Pharaoh and Egypt so that they can thrive. So we can really look at it this way at the end of Genesis. The people can look at it this way. They can get excited. They can say, yes, we are in charge. We have all these people now. Joseph is helping everybody do well. This is great. We should lean into what Joseph is doing to help his people. I mean, everything's good. People are growing. Our families are getting bigger. Things are going so well. And things are going really well for God's people in Egypt. But just as soon as things are going well, the narrative shifts, as we've read. And the story of Exodus really begins this way. There came along a king who forgot Joseph. There came along a king who forgot Joseph. And from there, the tide kinds of turns, and the oppression of the Hebrews just kind of ramps up from there. They find themselves as slaves in a strange land, and they again are left wondering, how do we fit in, and what does it mean? What does it mean for us to live faithfully in this place? Especially, that's a good question for us. What does it mean for us to live here, especially as we're trying to raise our kids? And we're trying to help our grandchildren to be faithful in the midst of this culture. I mean, it's just hard. So this morning, I have a couple of things that I want to share with you out of Exodus. Now, this is something they tell you not to do in preacher school. They don't like to do this in preacher school, right? Because everything this morning starts with one letter. Right? And they just don't like you to do that. But today I'm going to break the preaching rules, right? And because this morning there's 5 thoughts I want to give to you, and they all begin with the letter P. Thoughts about Exodus that can translate into our world today that start with the letter P. Number 1, Exodus, I believe, I need a drink of water. Exodus is fundamentally about politics. Exodus is fundamentally about politics. Now, don't get nervous, please. Don't stop breathing, when I say that, all right? But we have to think about politics because Exodus is about this, right? Who do we think is actually Lord of creation? That's a political question. Is it Pharaoh? The one who has power and might and wealth? Because clearly the gods must be on his side, or they wouldn't bless him as much as they have. Or do we trust in the Lamb who sits at the center of the table slain? It's a political question. It's a question of who do we actually think is king of the universe. But even more than that, Exodus is about how God is trying to form his people who live in a different politic of the world. I better say that again. God's trying to form a people who live in a different politic of the world. Because honestly, having read what we just read, there are 2 really huge political sermons in this text. Did you know that? There's some pretty good sermons in there on politics, especially in the way it impacts us today. So when I say this, don't blame me, okay? I'm just the messenger. But one sermon you could preach out of this text is a really hard sermon on abortion. This text is about Pharaoh's lack of concern, especially for newborns who don't have a voice, who don't have position, who don't have power. You could preach that out of this text, a sermon on abortion. And if you lean right in the political arena, you could send me some happy emails about this sermon. If you lean left on this particular issue, you could send me some very evil texts, evil emails about these, right? The other political sermon that you could preach, again, I'm the messenger here, but the other political sermon that you could preach out of this text is a really good sermon on immigration. Because this text is fundamentally about how Pharaoh has a people who are not like him, who live in his land, and whose economy is dependent upon these folks. Ouch. Right? You could preach that out of this text. And then, once again, depending on where you're at on the political spectrum, you can decide whether or not you're going to send a happy or an evil email. Right? So if you don't hear anything else today, though, here's why I hope you understand. Hear this. The Bible doesn't want you to lean left or right. The Bible doesn't want you to lean left or right. It just wants you to be shaped by the politics of the people of God. As kingdom folk, we live under a different kind of politics while we live in a world that is counterculture to that. This is a politic that cares about not only the newborn, but for these folks who are in slavery in Exodus. So yes, it's about politics. Right, I got the hard one out of the way. But it's also about pictures. Exodus is about pictures. one philosopher writes, our life operates in terms of pictures and language. In other words, we have our own ways, you and I, of seeing the world. We have our own picture of what it would look like. Again, Trent and his family, they're in Florida. The Halshes just got back from Florida. Who else is going there? The Smiths just got back from Florida. Everyone's going to Florida. But if you travel to another culture, if you travel to another country where the Deemers are today, or even if you travel to a different state, you may say something like this when you see someone doing something. Why do they act like that? It's so weird that those people are doing things that way, right? Because we have our own picture, but we find ourselves in another land, another culture, another place. Why are they doing like that? But guess what? By the way, they in turn will look at us and say, why do you do that? Right? That's so weird that you do that. We all have a different picture of how we think the world should work. We have pictures of how we think families ought to work, how neighborhoods work, how our systems should work, how our governments, how our communities. We have our own view of how we believe that should work. And so I think Exodus wants to mess with that picture just a little bit. Just a little bit. Exodus wants to mess with us. Because we are so used to people who are in charge as being agents of change, and we are conditioned to seeing power operate in certain kinds of ways. That's just the way even our political system today, and the way things happen, a lot of times that's just the way, what's that saying? That's just the way that it is. That's just our picture that we have of it. But Exodus wants to invert that. Exodus wants to turn that all upside down. I mean, we don't even know Pharaoh's name. We don't know Pharaoh's name. He's just some king of Egypt. Now, lots of folks have made some attempts at guessing what his name is. If you watch the Ten Commandments, Cecil B. DeMille, he gave Pharaoh a name. I can't remember what it was, Ramses, right? Is that what he did? But we really don't know Pharaoh's name. And some folks believe that we're not supposed to know Pharaoh's name. Because guess what? Pharaohs are all the same. One Pharaoh to the Pharaoh, he doesn't need a name because they're all the same. Pharaohs are all the same. So there's no names there. And so in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the storyteller, Pharaoh is just like another Pharaoh who acts like all the pharaohs of the world. And yet, and here's why I really love this passage today. And yet, we are not even very far into this thing, and we know the names of two Hebrew women. Verse 8. Now a new king came to power, and they had to build storage cities named Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. Verse 15. The king of Egypt spoke to two Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah in verse 15. Pretty cool names. I dare you to name your next child Puah. I just double dog dare you to try that. Right? And if you don't have the nerve for it, when you get a pet, that's Shiphrah. There's my dog right there. Shiphrah, right? We need a good Shiphrah around here to dedicate as a baby, honestly, right? We know these names. We know these women's names. But here's the irony of it. We know who Shiphrah and Puah are. We know their names, but we don't know Pharaoh's name. And we never will. But we sure do know about these two obscure Hebrew midwives who, on the scale of history, would not be mentioned. You see, in God's kingdom, things are kind of upside down. In God's upside down kind of kingdom, we know who Shiphrah and Puah are. There are no insignificant, I don't know if I can say this right. There are no insignificant people in this story. There are no insignificant people in this story. There are no insignificant people in this room. You need to know that. You are not insignificant. at all. In fact, Shipra and Puah, they matter more to God's purposes than Pharaoh does. It's kind of ironic that Pharaoh's worried about the boys. He wants to get rid of all the males, all the boys. And then the whole story really is about how females are undoing that power. You see that? And he wants to get rid of the sons, and he finds these midwives, and these women are undoing in many ways what Pharaoh wants to achieve. Pharaoh throws all the babies into the Nile, and then out of the Nile, when Moses comes out of the Nile, what Pharaoh threw in to the Nile, what came out brought redemption in Moses, in that basket. Anything that Pharaoh does seems to be undone. And we'll certainly see that when we get to the plagues. It's even ironic that in Pharaoh's own household there's disobedience going on to his own order. Because guess what? Guess whose household is taking care of this Hebrew child that came out of the waters? Pharaoh. And his daughters even know it. His daughters are not even paying attention to what he says. So in Exodus, we are invited to see a life in a different kind of perspective. Egypt is about politics. It's about a new imagination, a new picture, right? But in this story, we're also invited to practices. We've talked about that. For example, there's the practice of Passover, which begins Passover is 6 weeks away, but Lent is just under 2 weeks away. I know Lent is coming because when I see these Poochie commercials, that's how you know it's coming, because you see all these commercials, because Fat Tuesday is right around the corner. Although I'm afraid I live it every day, but still, it's there's practices of discernment, practices of resistance. Because we need practices, as we've said, we need practices that will help us discern what is right and what is wrong in the world. And so as God's people, we participate in particular practices so that we can know that Pharaoh is not God. You track me there? We participate in particular ways. We do particular kinds of things so that we can be sure, we can know, we can practice the idea that Pharaoh is not God. Because newsflash, Pharaoh is not God. In case you need a reminder of that today, Pharaoh is not God. The heads of state, I'm sorry, are not God. No matter how much Pharaoh wants to tell you, no matter how much anyone else will want to tell you that they are, they're not. Pharaoh's not. And so these practices of discernment help the people of God just to be able to see that, to live under that. And because we can discern between right and wrong, and because we can discern between who is the boss and who is not, then we can practice and we can have practices of resistance. Because we are able to discern, because we're able to know who really is in charge, we can say things like this that Shipra and Puah say. Maybe I should not tell Pharaoh the truth this time. So the question really is for these two ladies, when is a lie a lie? And frankly, it's this little lie that we've read of the midwives that really throws scholars off a little bit. They struggle with this lie that they tell Pharaoh because they're people of God, right? But most will say, many will say that a lie, it cannot be a lie, put it this way, will say that it cannot be a lie if the question is a lie. It cannot be a lie if the question is a lie. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I don't know if you're familiar with him, some of his writings, but he puts it like this. He was in Nazi concentration camps back in those times, and he wrote about it. And as a theologian, was in prison and those kind of things. But he said to this, what do you do, he asked, what do you do if a Nazi comes to your door What if you do if a Nazi comes to your door and asks if there are any Jews living there? Right? Bonhoeffer would say, without giving it a second thought, he says you would tell them that they are not there, even though they are. But Bonhoeffer would say you would tell them they're not there. And you would tell them they're not there because the question itself is not truthful. Because the real question from the Nazis is this: are there any people in your house who are inferior and deserve to die? That's the real question that's being asked there. And Bonhoeffer would say, no, there isn't anybody who is inferior in this house and deserves to die. You see that? When is a lie a lie? Well, if the question is a lie itself. So essentially, Pharaoh asked the same question of the midwives. And the midwives recognize, they're able to discern the death-dealing question of Pharaoh because they really know what's going on. So I want to say to you this morning that Scripture recognizes that there are moments when we are called to creatively work around the system. To creatively work around the system. We see it in Psalms when David is being anointed and being called. There's a little bit of a fib going on there as well. We see it sometimes in the New Testament as well, you know. But it's the question: how do we answer a question that if the question is a lie? There are moments when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they say, we're not going to bow down to you, Nebuchadnezzar. We're not going to do it. And then there are moments when Daniel just goes to his room, ignores what the king says, and he prays disobediently. Scripture and Exodus are full of invitations to find practices where we can resist being squeezed into the mold of the culture. So we have politics, we have pictures, we have some practices in Exodus, but Exodus is also about persistence. Persistence. Because I just got to tell you, Exodus takes a long time. It's going to take some time for Moses to grow up to be a man. It's going to take some time for Moses to get kicked out of Egypt, and he's going to hang out in the wilderness for a while. It's going to take some time. It's going to take Moses coming back. And then when even Moses gets the people out of Egypt, it's going to take them another 40 years in the wilderness to get to the land that God gave to them. The redemption, I wish I didn't have to say this. I wish it weren't true. But the redemption of God's people sometimes can take a long time. The journey of redemption is not an instantaneous journey. It could take, in fact, generations, as it did for these Hebrew folk. It may be looking towards a change. We may be looking towards a change that we will never see. We talked about that on Wednesday. These changes we're looking for, we may never see it. But we do it because our children might, and our grandchildren might, and our great-grandchildren might. We do these things in many ways not for us, but for future generations. Because things could take a little bit of time. It's a kind of a long obedience that God asks us to keep. So it takes persistence, faithfulness, and commitment over the long term. And the final one is this. The final P is this. We're going to have to trust in God's providence. In God's providence. Now you may notice when we're reading this text today that God's not mentioned in this text. We didn't really talk about God in Exodus number 1. But it's clear in the narrative that what goes on, you can see that God is at work. We can see that God is at work in protecting Shipra and Puah. And at the end, the scripture tells us that God honors them and he blesses those two women's family. Verse 21, and because the midwives respected God, God gave them households of their own. And I like it that God is in the act that he's protecting Moses. You have the bulrushes, and you have the image of the Nile River, and you have the image of this basket that is floating aimlessly down the river, and God just kind of sends Moses off in a little bit of a boat that has no rudder, that has no steering wheel, just like as we were talking about last night. The ark, did you know the ark didn't have a steering wheel? Did you know the ark didn't have a rudder? Would you like to know why? Because God was in control of where that thing went. He was going to move it. Same thing with Moses being in this little basket. God was working behind the scenes, moving Moses where he wants them to go. And so that Moses, if you will, dwells basically in that little basket in the protective ark the hand of God gave him to us. So here's how I think we should imagine this. Here's how I think we should think about this. God is always participating and working in the care and protection of his people so that the seed of ultimate change is in God's hands. So that on the waters of chaos, on the waters of tohu bohu, just like Noah was, God is protecting the seeds of ultimate redemption. Protecting the seeds of ultimate. It's the providence of God at work, even when we cannot see it. In fact, God doesn't even use his own people to make it happen. He recruits Pharaoh's daughter into this thing to make that happen. And yes, so don't be shocked by this. Some of you might. Again, you know where to send the emails, right? But God is even able to, I better start here. God is even able to use folks that we may disagree with to participate in the redemptive work of the world. He may use people that have a different ideology as us and think, but God will do what God will do to get his will done. So he may use people who we disagree with to do that. So the question that we have from the beginning from Paul is this: how do we live in this world and not be of it? What are we supposed to do while we're living in this world that is so counter to who we are? We keep working at being a people who live under a different kind of politics. That's how. We can become people who have practices and habits that will teach us to discern these things. We learn to be a people who trust in God's care, no matter how long it takes. We look for and we anticipate God is going to break out. We're hopeful that God, we look as people forward that God's going to be breaking out. He's going to be doing these kinds of things. And here's what I think Exodus is saying to me, that God has not stopped being at work in the redemption of the world. We're talking on Wednesday night. I've been looking at some stuff. I'm gonna preach on Revelation here eventually. Okay. I don't know when, but I'm working, and so the question came up, on Wednesday, and, how do we, the number of the beast and all those kinds of things. And, I see our problem is not our problem is, but we're fearful in many ways when we look at the end times. We're fearful that we won't know that we're not going to know what that mark is. We're not going to know who the Antichrist is or any of those. We're not going to, our fear is that we won't know. I just want you to know this morning that as people of God, as kingdom folk who are in tune to the Spirit, I want to assure you today that you will know. You'll be able to discern. God in the end times is not trying to fool his people. He is not trying to trick us. When those kinds of things happen, we will know. Now, that's just what I think. I suppose I could be wrong. But I'm going to say I'm right today. Just because, But we may be living in a time where in Pharaoh, we may be living in a time where Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 1, we may be living in a time where, like Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph, we may be living in a time where no one knows who we are. Our time is past. And if the culture, society, if it comes to a place where we don't know who Joseph is, and we live in a place where we don't even know who the God of Joseph is, you can be certain, I just want you to know that this is not the end of the story for the people of God, even though it feels like we've been forgotten. It's not the end, even though we feel like there's a lot of pressure coming in to people of faith and people who want to do what's right, and to people who want to find some kind of a sense to them. And it feels like we've been forgotten by whomever. I want you to know this morning that Exodus 1 tells us we are not forgotten. We have not forgotten. It is the providence of God who is moving behind those scenes for us. And it may be very well that this is the beginning. When we think we're forgotten, this may be the beginning. This may be the best part of our story. Because guess what? You are the unforeseen instrument of God's redemption. You are God's handiwork. So, live faithfully, practice discernment, persevere, be patient. Just see what God will do with where He has placed you. You are Shipra and Pua. It matters not to God whom the name of Pharaoh is, but it matters to him who Kirk is and Rick. We don't know Pharaoh's name. He knows your name this morning. And that is good news. He knows the name of your children. He knows the names of your grandchildren. He knows the names of the people around you. He really doesn't care who Pharaoh is. He knows who you are. God's ultimate story is not written through the pharaohs of the world, but God's story is written through the Shipra and Puas of the world. So don't be surprised when Jesus proclaims that the kingdom is like a mustard seed. So small. You can't even recognize it. But just watch what He'll do with that mustard seed. You are Shipra and Pua. And it's why we're going to gather in a few weeks for pizza and purpose. We're going to bring our best Shipra and Pua hats with us. And we're going to find creative ways to not undermine what's happening in our culture, not undermine it, but to be intentional about rescuing not only the people of God, but rescuing little children, and I mean this metaphorically, but rescuing little children who don't know what is happening in their surroundings, like little Moses in that basket. I promise you, little Moses as a baby had no idea what was going on and what we was headed to and all those kinds of things. But thank the Lord there was a Shipra and Pua that says, I know what God has for you. And so I'm going to do this in order for God to use Moses to get where He's going to be. You are Shipra and Pua. Pizza and purpose night. We are Shipra and Pua, knowing that what we do now, it may not impact us, but it may impact this place for generations and generations to come. So that's why we gather in 2 weeks, where we get to be Shipra and Pua. Amen.